Hello, this is the introductory video for the Frequently Asked Practice Queries webinar series. This series of 6 videos will address 5 common themes that come up in practice query conversations. I recommend watching this introductory video first so you'll understand the framework that is used to address each practice query in the following 5 videos. I'm Judith Pinto, Occupational Therapist and Practice Advisor at the Alberta College of Occupational Therapists. I am grateful to be recording this presentation today in Edmonton, Alberta. Situated on the North Saskatchewan River, this land has been the site for travel, rest, meeting, ceremony, relationship building, and trade by Indigenous communities, primarily the Cree, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and Métis, for thousands of years. Edmonton is located in Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. The image you see on your screen is of the Rossdale Cemetery in Edmonton. It's a memorial built to commemorate the traditional burial grounds that were located on the Rossdale Flats. It's just on the north side of the Waltertail Bridge, a corner I have traveled many times and hadn't noticed this particular memorial site. The burial grounds used to be part of EPCOR's power plant site until remains were found and a section of that site was then blocked off. The City of Edmonton, EPCOR, descendants of the traditional bands of the area, and other community members came together to create this memorial, which was officially opened in 2006 and is protected by law. So with that, let's begin today's recording in the spirit and intent of treaty, one of mutual respect. In this introductory video, we'll review the background and framework for practice queries, give you an overview of the practice query conversation, and review some of the most relevant legislation, recognizing that this will not be a comprehensive review of legislation, but we'll make a good start. So some background. We begin with needing to understand ACOT's mandate, which is to protect and serve Albertans. ACOT is charged to do this by regulating safe, competent, ethical occupational therapy practice in Alberta. ACOT Council has given its support to fielding practice queries as one method to protect the public. ACOT receives practice queries from everyone: occupational therapists, employers, insurance companies, educational institutions, and the general public. Responses to practice queries are based on the PRISM model of ethical decision-making and the College of Occupational Therapists of Ontario's decision-making framework. ACOT uses a modified version of these models. The practice query process begins with usually a phone call or an email. Typically, there is some indication in the message as to what the question or problem might be, and if the issue is within ACOT's mandate, we would proceed with step 2 of the practice query conversation. We'll discuss that process in the next slide. In responding to practice queries at our end, we may consult with colleagues, review legislation, review ACOT standards of practice and code of ethics, and review the OT competencies. Our goal is to respond within 24 to 48 hours. And while the conversation for a practice query may not go exactly in this sequence, these are essentially the considerations that go into responding to practice queries. First, as discussed in the previous slide, we clarify the question and triage. If the question is related to something outside of ACOT's mandate, we would make a referral to an appropriate resource or agency so that the person calling can have that question answered. This 10-step practice query conversation is tailored more specifically to registrants' questions as they relate to the 5 most common themes that we'll be addressing in the next 5 webinars. We begin with clarifying the question, getting a gut check. A review of legislation, regulations, and OT practice will typically answer the question as to whether or not a registrant can do something. The next step, an ethical check, can help to clarify whether a registrant should do something. A preliminary decision can be made at this time, but this guidance will direct each registrant to consider their individual clinical context, to seek additional information or guidance from other sources, and to arrive at a final decision that they are able to explain and justify. We'll be using this 10-step process in the next 5 webinars to address the frequently asked practice query topics. The next 5 webinars will reference some legislation and regulations that I'd like to review in brief. So I'd like to make sure that you know where you can find all of these resources on the ACOT website. If you click on the Practice Resources tab, you'll be able to access the many relevant documents that ACOT continually updates. You may find that a review of some of the documents here would answer your questions directly before calling in, or at least give you some grounding in terms of what we might need to consider. And finally, here's a brief review of the most pertinent pieces of information on the Practice Resources page of the ACOT website. The Health Professions Act, the Health Professions Restricted Activity Regulation, and the Occupational Therapist Profession Regulation regulates occupational therapy practice in Alberta. These pieces of legislation require that ACOT establish and maintain standards of practice that relate to continuing competence, the practice of occupational therapy, the performance and supervision of restricted activities, and other specifically legislated requirements, such as preventing sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. Under this regulatory framework, ACOT standards of practice and code of ethics establish expectations for registrants' practice of occupational therapy in Alberta. Applicable practice legislation includes the Health Information Act, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and the Personal Information Protection Act. They are all important pieces of legislation that registrants need to understand so they can implement appropriately into their practice. And finally, the Protection of Persons in Care Act, the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act, and Children First Act provide expectations for duty to report and information sharing when working with vulnerable sectors. All these documents and many others are available on the ACOT website for your review. I encourage you to take some time to review them, as they may help you decide how you proceed with your practice in healthy, helpful ways. So our 10-step process will be applied to the next 5 webinars to address the frequently asked practice query topics of conflict of interest, cross-jurisdictional practice, informed consent, supervision, and private practice. Thank you for watching this introductory video. I do hope it makes it easier to use the information presented in the upcoming webinars. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out, judith.pinto@acot.ca, or phone 780-436-8381, extension 405.